Morning arrived over the Sea of Galilee in sheets of gold, turning the harbor into a mosaic of light, rope, wood, and moving water. Fishing boats knocked softly against the pier while merchants shouted prices, gulls circled overhead, and the smell of salt and wet nets clung to the air. In the middle of that practiced chaos stood John, only 17, lean from labor and bright with the restless energy of youth, hauling a dripping net hand over hand beside his older brother James. Their father, Zebedee, moved through the boat with the confidence of a man who had built his life plank by plank, catch by catch, teaching with quick glances when words were unnecessary and correcting with a steady hand when work demanded precision. This was more than a job to them, it was inheritance, identity, and proof that a family could survive by trusting the lake, their strength, and each other. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of mending rope, sorting fish, and calling to nearby crews, there was a tension John could not name, as if the harbor itself were holding its breath for something larger than the day's trade. John worked hard because hard work was expected, but he also worked with the private fire of someone convinced he was meant for more than repetition. He had a temper that flashed quickly and a courage that rose just as fast, and there were days when he secretly liked the nickname others would one day remember, a son of thunder, because it sounded like destiny rather than immaturity. He imagined strength as conquest, faith as bold action, manhood as the moment when everyone around him would see that he was no longer a boy on his father's deck. James understood him better than most, trading sharp smiles and brief words while they pulled against the weight of the morning catch, yet even between brothers there were silences too deep for jest. John noticed how Zebedee watched them now, not simply as workers but as heirs, measuring their shoulders, their judgment, and their readiness for the future of the family business. The old man's pride was plain, but so was the anxiety hidden inside it, because every father knows there comes a day when sons either become the pillars of the house or walk beyond its walls. John sensed that day approaching without knowing from which direction it would arrive. It came not as a storm but as a voice carried over water and noise, cutting through the harbor with a strange authority that made John lift his head before he fully understood why. People had already been speaking of Jesus, the teacher from Nazareth who talked about the kingdom of God as though it were not a distant dream but a reality pressing against the skin of the present world. Some dismissed him as another preacher passing through, while others told stories in lowered voices, stories of hearts unsettled, demons rebuked, and ordinary people leaving his presence unable to return unchanged. John had heard enough to be curious and enough to be cautious, because rumor often grew larger than truth along a shoreline crowded with travelers and trade. But when he saw Jesus near the waterline, there was nothing inflated or theatrical in him. He stood with the calm of someone entirely at home in his purpose, looking not at the strongest boats or the wealthiest crews, but directly at men whose hands still smelled of labor. Then the call came, simple and impossible at once, an invitation to follow, to leave the nets, to step out from what was known into a future not yet explained. In that instant the noise of the harbor seemed to fall backward, and John felt something move inside him more powerful than ambition, more unsettling than fear. His first instinct was not surrender but resistance, because the call exposed the cost before it revealed the reward. He looked at the coiled ropes, the baskets of fish, the scarred wood beneath his feet, and each familiar object suddenly seemed heavier, as if the whole life of his family had wrapped itself around his ankles. Zebedee said nothing at first, yet silence from a father can press harder than a shouted command, and John searched his face for permission, protest, anything that would make the choice easier. What he found was harder still, pride fighting sorrow, love refusing to become possession, a man trying to bless what he could not bear to lose. James stood near him, equally torn, and for a fleeting second John wondered whether courage might mean staying, whether loyalty required him to remain in the boat and become exactly what everyone expected. But another part of him, deeper than duty and older than his years, knew that a voice capable of reaching the center of him would not be silenced by convenience. He had wanted greatness, now greatness appeared before him wearing the face of surrender. He had dreamed of changing the world by force of will. Now he sensed that the world would be changed by learning to walk behind this rabbi whose power did not resemble any power he had known. The decision did not arrive with dramatic music or thunder from heaven, only with the unbearable clarity that comes when a soul recognizes its road. John set down the net, and the smallness of the gesture made it even more profound, because entire futures sometimes turn on motions that seem almost ordinary to anyone passing by. He stepped from the boat onto the pier, feeling the shift from wood to stone as though crossing a border no map could mark. James moved with him, and together the brothers turned toward Jesus while the harbor continued its business around them, unaware that history had just altered course among fish scales and damp rope. Behind them, Zebedee remained in the boat, standing very still, a father framed by the tools of the life he had given his sons and the emptiness their leaving would create. John looked back only once, long enough to see in Zebedee's eyes both wound and wonder, then forward again toward the shoreline where Jesus waited like the horizon made human. The security of the family trade was falling behind him with every step, yet what rose in its place was not regret. It was a trembling certainty that he was being called not away from his life's meaning, but toward it. So began the journey of John, not as a saint already polished by memory, but as a young man still fierce, uncertain, and full of questions he did not yet know how to ask. He left the boat carrying no visible trophy, only the invisible fracture and healing that happen when love for family meets obedience to a greater call. The lake would remain, the boats would still launch at dawn, and Zebedee would continue under a sky now made wider by sacrifice, but John would never again belong only to the harbor that raised him. Ahead lay dust roads, crowded villages, miracles that would overturn reason, rebukes that would humble pride, friendships forged in danger, and the long shadow of a cross not yet fully imagined. For now there was only the first step, the first surrender, the first look toward a teacher who saw in a fisherman's son not merely what he had been, but what grace would make of him. In that moment the themes that would define his life were already present: youth reaching toward purpose, family learning the cost of love, and discipleship beginning where certainty ends. If this first step of John's story moved you, take a moment to like and share this video so more people can experience the beginning of his journey. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we follow him beyond the shoreline, through wonder and failure, loyalty and fear, all the way toward the cross and the empty tomb.